Before Ed Gein became a name whispered in true crime history, he was just a quiet, awkward boy trying to survive a world he didn't understand. Neighbors remembered him as gentle. Teachers said he was polite. Nothing about him hinted at the darkness he'd one day be connected to. And maybe that's the saddest part, because underneath everything, there was a child who never stood a real chance. Behind that child stood his mother, Oxta, a woman whose control, beliefs, and fear-driven worldview were far more terrifying than anything her son eventually became. When investigators later searched his farmhouse, furniture made from human skin, bowls crafted from human skulls, masks made from real human faces, a belt made of human nipples, lampshades covered in human flesh. This wasn't just murder. This was something psychologists had never seen. But those horrors didn't start in adulthood. They started in Augusta's home. And once you see how deeply she shaped him, you may find yourself asking the question no one wants to face. What if the true monster in this story wasn't Ed at all? November 16th, 1957 began like any other cold Saturday in Plainfield, Wisconsin, a town so small that the hardware store doubled as a gathering place. People trusted each other here. Doors weren't locked. Strangers weren't really strangers. And Bernice Worden, the woman who ran the local hardware store, was one of the most familiar faces in town. She opened early, worked alone, and knew her customers by name. That morning, though, something felt wrong before anyone even stepped inside. Her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, arrived at the store around mid-morning, expecting to find his mother behind the counter. Instead, the building was silent, the lights off, and the front door slightly ajar. That wasn't like her. Not on a weekend, not before the holiday season, and certainly not without telling anyone. When he stepped inside, the quiet was unsettling in a way he couldn't explain. It didn't feel like a store between shifts. It felt abandoned. Frank called out for her. No answer. He walked deeper, past the aisles she straightened every morning, past the register she handled with the precision of someone who had been doing the job for decades. Then he saw it. Something on the floor that made his breath catch. A disturbance. Something that looked like a struggle. And beside it, a receipt. One single sales slip from that morning. The name written on it stunned him. Ed Gein. Plainfield didn't have celebrities, but Ed was as close as it got to a local curiosity. Quiet, strange, solitary. A man people whispered about but never feared. He lived alone on a decaying farm miles outside town, a property swallowed by trees, silence, and rumors. Frank didn't waste time. He backed out of the store, radioed the sheriff's office, and told them exactly what he saw. Within minutes, a search began, starting at the one place no one ever wanted to go, the Gein farmhouse. Deputies approached the property with caution. The land felt abandoned, yet something about it seemed too alive, too aware of their presence. As they walked through the overgrown yard, the wind rattled rusted metal scraps scattered across the ground. There were no footprints leading in, no smoke from a chimney, no movement. Just that eerie stillness that made seasoned officers grip their flashlights a little tighter. When they reached the front door of the farmhouse, one deputy knocked. No answer. Another pushed the door gently, and it creaked open into darkness. Not the kind of darkness that comes from nightfall. This was the kind created by years of curtains never opened and light bulbs long burnt out. The smell hit them first. Something old, something wrong. Flashlights cut through the shadows, landing on piles of newspapers, trash, broken furniture, and clutter stacked so high it created narrow pathways through the house. But it wasn't the filth that froze them in place. It was the objects mixed into it. Objects that shouldn't have existed in any home. They found human remains repurposed into everyday items throughout the house. Reconstructed, reshaped, reimagined in ways investigators had never encountered before. There were objects meant for sitting, objects meant for storing, objects meant for wearing, each one undeniably connected to a human source. Nothing prepared them for it. Not their training, not their years on the job, not the quiet predictability of rural Wisconsin. They weren't just inside a criminal's home. They were inside someone's unraveling mind made physical. Someone who had lived alone long enough to blur the lines between reality and delusion. Someone who had built a world out of things no human should ever use or keep. Every officer who stepped into that house later admitted the same thing. The silence inside was the worst part, as if the walls themselves were holding a secret, waiting for someone brave enough to ask the right question. Outside, other deputies followed tracks in the snow to a small shed behind the house. Inside, they made the discovery that confirmed their worst fears. But even then, even with everything pointing toward a horrific crime, Ed Gein himself was nowhere to be found. They searched the property, called for backup, and began canvassing nearby homes. That's when they found him, at a neighbor's kitchen table, chatting casually as if nothing were unusual about the day. When officers stepped inside, Ed didn't run. He didn't argue. He didn't even look surprised. He simply stood up, put his hands behind his back, and said, almost politely, "I know why you're here." That stillness, that calm, that eerie acceptance unsettled every officer in the room. It wasn't the reaction of someone caught. It was the reaction of someone who had been waiting. Word of the farmhouse spread like wildfire. By the time state investigators arrived, crowds were gathering along the country road, staring toward the property with disbelief and dread. Reporters rushed in from across the state, and in the weeks that followed, Plainfield became the center of a national shockwave. Because what police found inside Ed Gein's home wasn't just evidence of murder. It was the blueprint for some of the most iconic horror characters Hollywood would ever create. Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. All of them carried pieces of Plainfield, echoes of a man who lived in isolation long enough for madness to become routine. But here's the part that most people never understand. If you stop the story at the farmhouse, you completely miss the most dangerous part of this case, because the crimes were only the ending. The true horror began decades earlier, with the one person Ed Gein trusted the most, the one voice he never escaped, the one influence that shaped him long before anyone knew his name, his mother. And what she did to him didn't leave physical scars. It left something far more permanent. If you're finding this story eye-opening or important, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone you care about. Understanding the roots of a case like this helps us recognize warning signs in real homes, before another tragedy ever reaches this point. Now, let's go back, long before the farmhouse, long before the headlines, back to the childhood that built Ed Gein from the inside out. Augusta Wilhelmina Gein did not enter the world quietly, and she did not move through it gently. She was born into a strict religious family where the rules were clear, absolute, and suffocating. Sin was everywhere. Temptation was always lurking, and women, especially women who showed any independence or desire, were gateways to corruption. From a young age, Augusta carried these beliefs like armor, convinced that she alone understood the battle between purity and immorality. What began as inherited doctrine grew into something far stronger inside her. A worldview shaped by fear, control, and the conviction that she was right and everyone else was dangerously wrong. Her faith was not comforting or hopeful. It was rigid, punishing, and absolute, and she held on to it with a grip so tight it would eventually shape the fate of her entire family. When Augusta married George Gein, it was not for love, companionship, or possibility. It was for survival. George, a quiet man with a weak constitution, struggled to keep work and frequently turned to alcohol. To Augusta, his failures were not simply personal flaws. They were confirmations of her darkest beliefs about men and their lack of discipline. She saw his drinking as a direct punishment from God, a reminder that desire, especially romantic or sexual desire, only led to misery. Every argument, every bill they could not pay, every disappointment became proof to her that she had made the mistake of trusting a man. And instead of seeing him as an individual with struggles, she blamed the entire world around her for corrupting him. In her mind, her suffering was not caused by George's choices. It was caused by the sinful nature of humanity itself. This belief grew into something sharp and destructive inside her. Augusta convinced herself that if her life had been ruined, the root cause was not her husband or her circumstances. It was desire. It was the influence of women she considered immoral. It was the world that encouraged independence, pleasure, and freedom. She came to see herself as the lone pure woman standing against a society drowning in sin. This mindset hardened her, wrapped her in bitterness, and pushed her to create a home built on fear instead of love. She believed she was chosen to raise her children under her strict interpretation of morality, an interpretation that allowed no mistakes, no joy, and no emotional space for anything outside her control. Daily life in the Gein household was shaped entirely by Augusta's rigid rules. Every morning and every night, she held Bible readings at the kitchen table. But these sessions were not about comfort or guidance. She focused only on passages that spoke of punishment, judgment, hell, and the downfall of the wicked. She read about immoral women, sinful behavior, and the fate of those who strayed from righteousness. These readings were not lessons, they were warnings. Henry and Ed sat quietly, absorbing every word, even when they did not understand the weight of what she was planting in their minds. Their childhood memories were not built on laughter or discovery. They were built on sermons about wrongdoing and the promise of destruction for anyone who stepped out of line. Augusta's teachings went beyond religion. She told her sons that women outside their home were dangerous, manipulative, and untrustworthy. She insisted that any woman who showed friendliness or warmth toward them had ulterior motives. According to Augusta, the world was filled with temptresses and sinners who waited for innocent boys to fall into their traps. She told them that only she was pure, only she was trustworthy, and only she could save them from the darkness she believed lived inside other people. This message repeated day after day, shaping the boys' understanding of relationships before they ever stepped into adulthood. It created an environment where the outside world became frightening, confusing, and forbidden. In her eyes, she was not simply a mother, she was a shield. She cast herself as the only virtuous woman in a world overflowing with corruption. Augusta positioned herself as the center of moral authority, and everyone else, neighbors, teachers, relatives, became threats to her son's purity. She kept her household isolated, limiting interactions with other families and discouraging friendships. If a girl at school smiled at Ed, he was punished. If Henry asked questions, she dismissed them with the same cold certainty. Her home became a closed system where her voice was the only voice that mattered. And for young Ed, who idolized her, that voice became the foundation for how he understood everything: the world, other people, and himself. As Ed grew older, Augusta's grip did not loosen. Instead, it grew stronger, shaping his emotional development in ways he never fully recognized. He saw her not as a demanding or harsh parent, but as the single source of truth. Every belief she imposed on him carried the weight of divine certainty. She made him fear attachment, fear independence, and fear anyone who wasn't her. The world beyond their home did not feel exciting or full of potential. It felt dangerous and unpredictable, an environment he was never taught to navigate. Her influence reached into every corner of his life, from how he viewed women to how he interpreted behavior he did not understand. She built a psychological cage around him, and Ed, having known nothing else, accepted it as the natural structure of living. Even in the small moments, Augusta's control was total. She monitored her son's emotions, corrected their thoughts, and judged their reactions. If they showed curiosity about the world, she shut it down. If they expressed interest in other people, she condemned it. She used fear as both a tool and a language, creating a home where affection was rare and approval was conditional. For Henry, this created resentment, a growing awareness that something was deeply wrong. But for Ed, who was quieter, more sensitive, and more eager to please, it created loyalty. He clung to her approval not out of obligation, but out of survival. Her voice became the one he trusted, even when that voice filled him with shame, terror, and confusion. Augusta's worldview, shaped by her own trauma and bitterness, became the blueprint for Ed's mind. Everything he later struggled with, the isolation, the fear of women, the confusion between desire and sin, can be traced back to the teachings she delivered every day of his childhood. Her influence was not temporary, it was permanent. She didn't simply guide him, she molded him, shaped him, and left him without the tools to exist in any world but the one she controlled. And as the years passed, that control did not weaken. It grew roots so deep that even after her death, he continued living by rules she had carved into him. Augusta didn't just read the Bible, she weaponized it, and her two sons, Henry and Ed, were her permanent congregation. In 1914, Augusta made a decision that would shape the rest of her family's lives. She convinced her husband, George, to move them away from the town and settle on a remote farm several miles outside Plainfield. The public reason was simple. They wanted to raise crops, live off the land, and escape the noise of the growing community. But the deeper truth was far more revealing. Augusta wanted distance, not just from the temptations she feared, but from the people she believed were immoral, corrupt, and dangerous to her sons. In her mind, the isolation of a remote farm was not just protection. It was control disguised as righteousness. Life on that farm became the perfect setting for the psychological world Augusta wanted to build. With no neighbors close by, no casual visitors, and no outside voices challenging her beliefs, she had full authority over what her children learned and how they viewed the world. Her strict rules felt normal inside those walls because there was no comparison, no outside life for the boys to experience. To the public, the family became known as quiet farmers who kept to themselves. But privately, the farm was a place where Augusta's fears, judgments, and rigid beliefs filled every hour of every day. She had created her own universe, and she intended to raise her sons inside it, without interference. Ed's childhood unfolded quietly in this isolated world. He was polite, obedient, and gentle, traits that teachers and neighbors noticed whenever they saw him in town. He didn't cause trouble, didn't challenge authority, and rarely raised his voice. He seemed shy, almost withdrawn, as if he didn't quite know how to fit into the world outside his home. But inside the house, Augusta didn't see softness or sweetness. She saw burden. She favored Henry, the older son, believing he was more practical and capable. Ed, in her eyes, was too sensitive, too attached, too eager for approval. A weakness she wanted to crush before it turned into independence. School offered Ed a small window into normal childhood, but even that window closed quickly. From the moment he walked into a classroom, it was clear he was different. His clothes were plain, his social skills undeveloped, and his world experience limited to the boundaries Augusta allowed. He tried to make friends, but he was awkward, unsure, and often misunderstood by the other children. Some kids bullied him quietly, mocking his odd behavior, laughing at his confusion, or teasing him when he didn't understand jokes. And any moment of kindness he received at school was destroyed the moment he got home. If a girl smiled at him or sat beside him at lunch, Augusta punished him with shouting, lectures, and Bible readings that painted such interactions as sinful traps. For Ed, affection became a source of fear, and connection became something dangerous. At home, the rules were even stricter. There were no friends allowed to visit. No birthday parties, no sleepovers, no hobbies that weren't approved by Augusta. The Gein farm was not a house. It was a closed system. Ed was expected to come home straight after school, complete his chores, and sit through the evening Bible sessions that had become ritual. These sessions were filled with passages about judgment, sin, and the downfall of the wicked. Never the comforting parts, never the lessons about kindness or forgiveness. Augusta used scripture not to teach her children values, but to maintain control over their thoughts. There was no laughter, no creativity, and no sense of freedom. Just work, silence, and fear of disappointing the one person who controlled everything. Privacy did not exist in the Gein household, especially for Ed. Augusta monitored his movements, controlled his schedule, and kept him within arm's reach whenever she could. She managed the home in a way that left him with no space to grow independently, and no room to form a personal identity separate from her. His sleeping quarters were arranged close to hers, and she never allowed him to have a space of his own where he could explore interests or ideas she did not approve of. This lack of personal boundaries prevented Ed from ever experiencing autonomy. It kept him emotionally tethered to her long after most children start building their own inner world. In her view, distance was danger, and closeness meant obedience. Psychologically, what Augusta created is known today as enmeshment, a dynamic where a parent's identity consumes the child's, leaving no separation between their thoughts, beliefs, or emotions. For Ed, this meant he never learned how to develop his own opinions or make independent decisions. His sense of self became a reflection of Augusta's fears, judgments, and expectations. He didn't question her rules or push back against her teachings because he had never been given the tools to do so. His emotional world became dependent on her approval, and her approval was given only when he mirrored her worldview exactly. Over time, Augusta didn't just influence Ed, she replaced his inner voice with her own. This emotional captivity shaped every part of Ed's development. While Henry slowly began to see the dysfunction in their home, Ed moved in the opposite direction. His loyalty deepened, his dependence grew, and his identity shrank. He learned to suppress his questions, ignore his discomfort, and live according to a belief system he never chose. When he walked into town, he carried Augusta's warnings in his head. When he looked at other people, he saw sin, danger and corruption, because that was what she taught him to see. And when he came home, he retreated back into the only world he truly knew, the world where his mother's voice was the final authority. By the time Ed reached his teenage years, the psychological damage was already complete. He wasn't building friendships, exploring interests, or finding his own path. He was following a script written entirely by Augusta. His life lacked choice, lacked independence, and lacked the personal growth most children experience as they move toward adulthood. The years he spent on that farm didn't just shape him, they erased him. He became a vessel for beliefs he never questioned and fears he never understood. In every meaningful way, the person he might have become never had a chance to exist. By the time Ed is a teenager, he isn't really Ed in the way you and I think of a person. He's his mother's beliefs walking around in a son's body. If you're still with us, let me know down in the comments. Drop your location, and if you made it to this point, type, "I'm still here." Your engagement helps us share these important stories with more people, and it makes sure the warning signs behind cases like this are never ignored again. Henry Gein, the older brother, was the one person in the family who saw the world with clearer eyes. Unlike Ed, Henry worked jobs outside the farm, spent time around other adults, and had glimpses of normal life beyond Augusta's strict control. He helped with construction, did labor for nearby farms, and learned how other families lived and spoke and argued without fear. These experiences shaped him into someone more grounded, more realistic, and more willing to question the beliefs he grew up with. While Ed quietly absorbed everything their mother said as absolute truth, Henry grew more skeptical with age, slowly recognizing that the world she preached about didn't match the world he witnessed. And that difference, small at first, became the beginning of a silent divide between the brothers. As the years went on, Henry began gently testing the boundaries of Augusta's influence, especially when he was alone with Ed. He would tell him things like, "Mother is wrong about some things," or "You don't have to think the way she does." For Ed, these were confusing moments. Some part of him felt curious, almost relieved to hear someone question Augusta, but another part felt fearful. Augusta's voice was the strongest authority in his mind, and hearing Henry challenge it felt like hearing someone speak against gravity or daylight. Still, Henry persisted, trying to show his brother that life didn't have to be a prison built from fear. He encouraged Ed to imagine a future where he could leave the farm, make friends, and be his own person. It was the first and only time in Ed's life that someone tried to pull him out of Augusta's psychological cage. But Augusta did not appreciate the shift she sensed in her oldest son. To her, Henry's independence was rebellion disguised as maturity. She admired her own convictions so deeply that any disagreement felt like betrayal against God's truth. In Augusta's eyes, she was the chosen, the righteous, the only pure woman left in a world full of corruption. She carried herself like a moral prophet inside her home, quoting scripture with the confidence of someone who believed she had been placed on earth to correct the failures of others. While Henry grew increasingly aware that her worldview was extreme and harmful, Augusta saw herself as the last line of defense protecting her children from sin. The contrast between them widened every year, Henry searching for normalcy, Augusta digging deeper into rigid beliefs, and Ed quietly trapped between them. The family dynamic shifted even further in 1940 when George Gein, the father, passed away. George had struggled with his own demons, especially alcohol, but his presence had still been a buffer between Augusta and the boys. With him gone, there were no other adults left in the household. No voice to soften Augusta's intensity. No witness to the emotional pressure she placed on her sons. Henry dealt with it by working more outside the home, distancing himself from her demands. But Ed became even more entangled in his mother's world. She leaned heavily on him, relying on him for chores, companionship, and emotional validation. George's death didn't just change the family structure. It tightened Augusta's hold on Ed in a way that would shape every choice he made going forward. By 1944, tensions in the household were quiet but constant. Henry loved his brother, but he was increasingly troubled by how deeply Augusta had shaped Ed's mind. He expressed his concerns to people outside the home, mentioning that Ed's attachment to their mother felt unhealthy and extreme. Some say Henry became blunt in his criticism of Augusta's behavior, calling her controlling and unreasonable. But inside the home, Ed saw none of this. He remained loyal to her, loyal in a way that made it hard for him to understand Henry's discomfort. This emotional divide came to a silent crossroads on May 16, 1944, the day of the brush fire. That afternoon, Henry and Ed were burning piles of brush on the property, a normal chore for early spring. The fire spread more quickly than expected, and soon flames were moving through the dry field. The brothers worked together, trying to control the blaze, but as smoke thickened and the wind shifted, they became separated. When the fire department arrived, they found Ed standing alone near the edge of the field. He appeared confused but calm, explaining that he had lost sight of Henry. When firefighters asked where his brother might be, Ed quietly led them to a spot in the woods. What startled them was not just the location. It was how quickly Ed brought them there, as if he had known the exact spot from the beginning. Henry was found lying on the ground in an area that wasn't badly burned. There were no signs of a struggle, and the fire hadn't touched him directly. The cause of death was listed as asphyxiation from smoke, but many found the scene strange. How had Ed located him so easily in a wooded area with minimal burning? Why wasn't Henry found near the fire line if smoke inhalation was the cause? And why did Ed seem so calm, almost detached, as the firefighters worked around him? These questions lingered but were never pushed. Plainfield was a small town. The brothers were known to be close, and no one wanted to believe that anything darker had happened on that quiet farm. The official ruling was accidental death. No investigation followed. No autopsy raised concern. And no one asked Ed further questions. The fire was declared the tragic result of an unfortunate brush burn gone wrong. But years later, investigators and psychologists would revisit this moment and wonder if something more complicated had occurred. Henry was the only person who openly challenged Augusta's influence over Ed. The only one who encouraged him to leave, think independently, or question the beliefs that had been forced into him. It raises a difficult question, one that cannot be answered but cannot be ignored. Did Henry collapse in the smoke? Or did the one person trying to pull Ed away from Augusta suddenly become a threat to the only relationship Ed understood? Whatever the truth was that day, one fact became the turning point of Ed's life. After Henry's death, there was no one left to challenge Augusta. She lost a son, but she gained complete control over the one who remained. From that moment on, it was just mother and son, on a farm with no witnesses. In 1945, Augusta suffered a sudden stroke, and the entire balance of power inside the Gein household shifted in an instant. This woman who had dictated every rule, every belief, and every emotion for decades was suddenly weak, frail, and dependent on the one person who worshipped her completely. The stroke didn't just affect her body, it affected the dynamic she built so carefully. For the first time, Ed wasn't the one being commanded. He was the one being needed. Nurses who treated her briefly, recalled how tightly she held on to him, how she insisted that only Ed handle certain tasks. And for Ed, whose entire identity had always revolved around pleasing her, this change awakened something powerful, a sense of purpose he had never felt before. As Augusta's condition worsened, Ed stepped into the role of full-time caregiver with a devotion that bordered on obsession. He fed her, bathed her, dressed her, and sat beside her for hours without speaking unless she initiated conversation. Every small task, bringing her meals, holding her hand, helping her to the bathroom, became a mission. He didn't see it as duty. He saw it as destiny. In his mind, all the warnings she gave him about the outside world finally made sense. He believed God had chosen him to protect her, to keep her safe from dangers only she could see. For a man who had never been encouraged to form his own identity, the feeling of importance was overwhelming. Being needed by Augusta made him feel alive in ways that nothing else ever had. This care period deepened an already unhealthy bond between them. Ed's attachment was no longer just emotional. It was existential. He couldn't imagine a life where he made decisions for himself or connected with other people. He couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't by her side every moment. Taking care of her didn't just fill his days. It swallowed his entire sense of self. While other adults his age were starting families, building careers, or exploring independence, Ed spent every day making sure Augusta was comfortable, fed, and attended to. He interpreted every improvement in her condition as proof that he was doing the work God intended for him. That belief tightened his dependency on her until it reached a point where he could no longer see where she ended, and he began. Then, on December 29th, 1945, Augusta died. Ed was 39 years old, well into adulthood, yet emotionally unprepared to live without her. The woman who had shaped every part of his worldview, who dictated what was right and wrong, who controlled every connection he was allowed to have, was suddenly gone. For most people, the death of a parent is devastating, but for Ed, it wasn't just devastating. It was unthinkable. He wasn't just losing a mother. He was losing the voice that told him who he was, how to live, how to think, and where he belonged. Standing over her body, Ed didn't experience grief in a healthy way. He experienced a psychological collapse that would never fully heal. His reaction to her death was immediate and revealing. Instead of beginning the difficult emotional work of grieving, Ed sealed off her bedroom and the main front rooms of the house. He shut the doors, locked them, and refused to disturb a single item. The bed where she slept, the clothes she folded, the Bible she kept on the nightstand. All of it remained exactly where she left it. To anyone else, it would look like a shrine. To Ed, it was a way to freeze time, a desperate attempt to keep her alive in the only way he could manage. The spaces she touched were sacred, untouchable, preserved in a way that made it clear he wasn't letting her go. In his mind, if he didn't change anything, then maybe she hadn't truly left him. While Augusta's room stayed untouched, the rest of the farmhouse went in the opposite direction. Ed moved into a small corner of the house that became cluttered, dirty, and chaotic. He slept in the kitchen or in a tiny back room surrounded by newspapers, old tools, and scraps he collected from town. Without Augusta's strict routines, the structure of his life fell apart. He no longer cleaned, no longer organized, and no longer cared about the home the way he once did. But the rooms he sealed off remained pristine, silent monuments to the mother he couldn't emotionally separate from. The contrast between those preserved spaces and the decay of the rest of the house revealed just how fractured Ed's mind had become. Psychologically, Ed was trapped in a world where his mother's influence was stronger in death than it had ever been in life. He had never developed a personal identity separate from her, so when she died, there was no version of himself left to fall back on. He didn't know how to make decisions, form relationships, or understand his own emotions without her guidance. Instead of grieving like most people, he tried to stop time, to keep the past alive through objects, routines, and memories. The sealed rooms weren't just about honoring her. They were about holding on to the last pieces of his identity. He believed that if her belongings stayed untouched, then her voice, her power, her presence might not disappear completely. This attempt to freeze time was not just tragic. It was the spark that ignited the next phase of Ed's unraveling. Without Augusta's voice directing him, his mind spiraled into a dangerous mixture of loneliness, confusion, and longing. He didn't seek companionship or help from others because he had been taught his whole life that outsiders were dangerous. He didn't explore new relationships because he believed women outside his mother were corrupt. His emotional world had been reduced to one single anchor. And when that anchor was buried, he was left drifting without purpose, structure, or reality to hold on to. The mental instability that had always lingered beneath the surface began to deepen. Ed's behavior after her death revealed a man who didn't know how to live without the presence he had depended on for nearly 4 decades. He wandered the farmhouse as if expecting to hear her voice again. He visited her grave obsessively. He repeated her old warnings out loud, as if rehearsing them to keep them alive. And when loneliness grew too sharp, he retreated into the sealed rooms, not physically, but mentally, imagining a world where she still sat in her chair, still preached from her Bible, still told him what to fear and what to avoid. The house became a physical representation of his fractured mind, one part frozen in worship, one part decaying from neglect. Augusta's body was buried, but inside Ed's mind, she never died. And that is where the next phase of this horror begins. If you're still with us, let me know down in the comments. Drop your location, and if you made it to this point, type, "I'm still here." Your engagement helps us share these important stories with more people, and it makes sure the warning signs behind cases like this are never ignored again. After Augusta's death, the farmhouse became a silent world where Ed wandered without direction, unable to fill the emptiness she left behind. By the late 1940s, the loneliness had grown into something heavier, something that didn't fade with chores or distraction. Ed found himself drawn to the cemetery where Augusta had been buried. At first, he visited during the day, standing quietly near her headstone, whispering to her as if she might answer back. But those daytime visits never gave him the closeness he craved, and soon he started returning at night. In the dark, with no one else around, he felt something he believed he had lost forever, a connection to her. And slowly, those night visits shifted from grief to something far more concerning. During these late-night trips, Ed began targeting the graves of middle-aged women who resembled Augusta in age, shape, and presence. These visits weren't random or impulsive. They were focused. He sought out women who reminded him of the mother he lost, women he believed had a kind of familiarity, as if they carried pieces of Augusta's essence. In Ed's mind, these choices weren't about harm or cruelty. They were about filling a void he didn't know how to live with. Psychologists later described this behavior as an attempt to undo loss, an attempt to bring back someone he couldn't emotionally release. But in the moment, Ed didn't think in clinical terms. He felt abandoned, hollow, and terrified of a world without the only voice he trusted. As months turned into years, Ed's behavior at the cemetery escalated. He crossed from mourning to disturbing attempts at reconnecting with the dead. He quietly removed remains from graves and brought them back to the farmhouse. What he did with them was not driven by curiosity or violence in the way most people imagine. Instead, it was a desperate attempt to recreate the presence he missed. In his mind, these remains weren't strangers. They were fragments of a mother figure he believed he could rebuild. He used parts of what he brought back to create items and objects he could keep close, turning his home into a distorted reflection of the attachment he never outgrew. The farmhouse slowly filled with things he crafted out of these remains, household objects and personal items that made him feel like Augusta wasn't entirely gone. This behavior spoke to a man whose understanding of death, identity, and love had been broken long before he ever stepped foot into a cemetery. Ed wasn't trying to create horror, even though horror was exactly what he produced. He was trying to fix a wound that normal grief could never touch. His attempts to rebuild what he lost were misguided and deeply disturbing, but they came from a psychological injury, not calculated cruelty. In his isolated world, the line between memory and reality blurred, and he clung to those items as if they could bring his mother back in some emotional form. It was a grief loop, one he could not break, one no one in town knew existed, and one that grew more dangerous as time passed. Eventually, the cemetery no longer felt like enough. Ed's attachment was not satisfied by memories or remains. He needed something closer to the living presence he had once felt. Over time, the distinction between the dead women he targeted and the living women he saw around town started to disappear. In his mind, they were connected, not as individuals, but as representations of the one woman he had lost. Ed didn't see these women as people with their own lives. He saw them through Augusta's shadow, as pieces of a puzzle he was trying to complete. The mental boundary between memory and reality, already fragile, began to collapse, and when it did, the behavior that had stayed hidden in graveyards moved out into Plainfield itself. The shift became clear on December 8th, 1954, the night Mary Hogan disappeared from her tavern. Mary was bold, outspoken, and physically similar to Augusta in a way Ed fixated on. Her disappearance shocked Plainfield. She was well known, and her tavern was a local landmark. Police found signs of a struggle, but no clear leads. At the time, no one even thought to suspect Ed Gein. He was quiet, helpful, and seemed harmless. Someone who did odd jobs for neighbors and kept mostly to himself. But in hindsight, Mary's disappearance marked the moment when Ed's internal world pushed into reality with irreversible force. 3 years passed before the town faced another disappearance. On November 16th, 1957, Bernice Worden vanished from her hardware store, leaving behind a trail that would finally expose Ed's hidden life. Bernice was a respected business owner, older, strong-willed, and independent. Another woman who resembled Augusta in age and presence. Her son, who also served as deputy sheriff, discovered the store closed unexpectedly. Inside, he found blood on the floor and a sales receipt showing the last customer had been Ed Gein. That discovery sent investigators directly to his isolated farmhouse on the edge of Plainfield, a place most locals rarely approached. The search that took place that night revealed a home frozen in grief, cluttered in neglect, and filled with evidence of years of emotional decay. Officers found objects made from human remains, items created over years, tied to grave robbing, to disappearances, and to Ed's attempts to rebuild his mother out of other women's bodies. None of what they saw followed a typical pattern associated with violence or intention to harm for pleasure. Instead, Investigators described the scene as the physical aftermath of a mind trying to patch a hole it didn't know how to mend. It wasn't just a crime scene. It was the living blueprint of Ed's psychological collapse, laid out across every room. Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden were not chosen at random. They both shared qualities that triggered Ed's fixation on Augusta. Older women with strong presences who, in his fractured state, symbolized the mother he could not let go. The cemetery visits, the grave disturbances, the crafted objects, the disappearances, each act was part of a pattern built on grief, obsession, and emotional dependence that had never been treated or understood. For Ed, these women weren't victims in the way the world sees them. They were unfortunate stand-ins for the one person he couldn't stop clinging to, even after death. Which brings us back to that November night. The night police first stepped into Ed Gein's farmhouse. They didn't just find evidence of a crime. They found a physical map of a man trying to rebuild his mother in the only ways his damaged mind understood. And the horror inside that house wasn't just what he had done. It was the realization that it all began decades earlier, with Augusta. When investigators entered Ed Gein's farmhouse that cold November night in 1957, most had no idea they were about to witness one of the strangest and most unsettling crime scenes America had ever encountered. They expected to find clues related to the disappearance of Bernice Worden, maybe evidence of a struggle, maybe signs that Ed had fled the property. But the moment their flashlights cut through the darkness of the cluttered kitchen and into the deeper rooms of the house, the tone changed. Officers found themselves pausing, stepping back, calling for more lights, and whispering to one another in disbelief. They had handled accidents, farm injuries, homicides, and local disputes, but nothing resembled what they saw inside that home. There was no clear organization, no sense of normal domestic life, and every room felt like it belonged to a different person, living inside the same collapsing structure. The deeper they went, the more overwhelming the scene became. The farmhouse was not simply dirty or abandoned. It was a reflection of a mind that had slipped far past the boundaries of ordinary reality. They found remains repurposed into household objects, tools, and items Ed kept close. Nothing was displayed proudly, nothing arranged like trophies. Instead, everything felt strangely functional, as if these objects served a personal meaning only Ed understood. Officers described the atmosphere as unnerving not because of gore, which they tried not to focus on, but because everything looked like part of a private world that had evolved in secret for years. It was the emotional weight of it, not just the physical evidence, that left seasoned officers shaken. As more deputies arrived, word spread quietly through Plainfield that something was deeply wrong at the Gein property. The men who stepped outside for air were pale, shaken, and unusually quiet. One officer leaned on his knees, trying to steady himself. Another stood staring toward the tree line with his hands trembling. Even the sheriff, who had seen decades worth of rural tragedies, was stunned by the sheer strangeness of what they documented. Yet despite their reactions, they worked with precision, photographing, labeling, collecting, and cataloging everything they found. The horror wasn't treated like spectacle, it was treated like evidence. And as the night wore on, one realization became unavoidable. Bernice Worden hadn't simply vanished. Her disappearance was connected to something far bigger, something that had been growing in Plainfield long before anyone noticed. While the farmhouse search unfolded, officers located Ed Gein at the home of a neighbor where he had stopped by earlier in the day. There was no chase, no resistance, no confusion. Ed walked calmly with the officers, answering when spoken to, moving without struggle. His face held a soft, blank expression, neither fear nor defiance. He didn't ask what was happening, didn't demand a lawyer, didn't deny anything. Even in handcuffs, wrapped in a coat against the Wisconsin cold. He looked more like a man being escorted to a doctor's appointment than someone being arrested for murder. The contrast between the chaotic farmhouse and the quiet man being led away was jarring to everyone who witnessed it. Once in custody, Ed sat in the interrogation room with the same calm detachment he displayed during the arrest. Officers tried to explain the seriousness of the situation, that Bernice Worden had disappeared, that evidence in his home connected to her, that he needed to speak clearly and truthfully. Ed nodded, polite, almost gentle. But his answers wandered, not because he was lying, but because his thoughts didn't follow the normal order. He didn't seem emotionally connected to the actions being discussed. When detectives asked direct questions, he responded as if describing the behavior of someone else entirely. There was no anger, no pride, no remorse, no shock. It was as if he didn't fully grasp the weight of what he had done. As the hours went on, Ed began to talk more openly. He admitted to visiting cemeteries at night. He admitted to taking remains from graves. And eventually, he admitted to killing both Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. But there was something chilling about how he described these acts. Not in a graphic way, but in the emotional emptiness of his tone. He talked about the women as if they were symbols, not individuals. He explained that he chose women who reminded him of his mother, women who had the same physical presence and the same age range. He said the lines between memory and reality had blurred, and when pressed on motivation, he said quietly, "I wanted to feel close to her again." He meant Augusta. Detectives found themselves struggling with how to respond. They weren't talking to a calculating criminal who planned every step. They were talking to a man whose mind had fractured years before, whose emotional world was still tied to a mother who had been dead for more than a decade. His descriptions weren't malicious. They were detached, as if he believed the acts made sense within his private universe. The lack of emotional understanding wasn't an act. It was his reality. Officers later said it felt like interrogating someone who was half awake, half in another world, answering questions from behind a fog. Because of the unusual mindset Ed displayed, psychiatrists were quickly brought into the case. Their evaluations painted a picture of someone living with severe mental illness, a man whose grasp on reality was unstable, whose identity had been swallowed by trauma and isolation. They noted his emotional immaturity, his dependence on his mother's belief system, and his inability to understand death and attachment in normal ways. They also observed that Ed didn't seem capable of forming adult relationships or independent thoughts. Everything he believed, everything he felt, seemed connected to Augusta's teachings, even after her death. The psychiatrists agreed that Ed wasn't faking or exaggerating. He was profoundly damaged, long before his crimes came to light. As reports accumulated, the legal system faced a difficult challenge. Ed had confessed to grave robbing and 2 murders. Evidence from his home supported those confessions. But his mental state raised serious questions about whether he understood the nature of his actions. In early proceedings, Ed was declared incompetent to stand trial. He wasn't sent to prison. He was sent to a psychiatric institution where doctors tried to treat his condition and evaluate whether he could eventually face trial. During his time there, he remained quiet, cooperative, and polite. Nurses described him as mild-mannered, helpful and unthreatening in daily routines. He read magazines, did simple chores, and lived an almost childlike life inside the institution's walls. Years later, after steady treatment and mental evaluation, the court determined that Ed was competent enough to understand the charges and participate in his defense. His trial finally began, focusing specifically on the murder of Bernice Worden. The courtroom was packed with reporters, locals, and experts, not because the community wanted spectacle, but because the case had stunned the entire country. People wanted to understand how someone who seemed so quiet and unassuming could be connected to something so unimaginable. Throughout the trial, Ed sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes rarely lifting from the table in front of him. He didn't whisper to lawyers, didn't react to testimony, didn't flinch when prosecutors described the evidence. It wasn't stoicism, it was detachment. He listened the way someone listens to a conversation happening in another room. The jury heard about his confession, the objects found in his home, the psychiatric evaluations, and the long history of isolation and emotional dependence on Augusta. They heard about the cemetery visits, the women he fixated on, and the distorted grief that drove his actions. The prosecution argued that despite his mental illness, Ed had committed murder and should be held legally responsible. The defense argued that his mind was so damaged he couldn't fully understand morality, danger, or consequence. In the end, the verdict landed in the middle ground. Ed Gein was found guilty, but mentally ill. It was a legal recognition that he bore responsibility for his actions, but that those actions came from a severely broken mind, rather than from cruelty or malice. Instead of prison, Ed was returned to state psychiatric institutions where he would spend the rest of his life. He was not seen as a man who could be rehabilitated or safely returned to society. His emotional development had never reached full adulthood, and his attachment to his mother remained central to every psychological evaluation until the end of his life. Ed lived in institutional care for decades, quiet, cooperative, and largely isolated from the world that had come to know his name. Staff described him as gentle, obedient, and unthreatening, someone who rarely spoke unless spoken to. He participated in simple activities, followed routines, and lived in a mental world frozen in time. The chaos of his farmhouse was replaced with the structure of hospital life, and in that controlled environment, he remained stable. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of natural causes at the age of 77. He passed away quietly, the same way he had lived most of his life, unnoticed, detached, and emotionally distant. Looking back, the law saw Ed Gein as a murderer. But psychologists saw something even more disturbing. A man who never grew into a full adult mind at all. A man whose identity was consumed by a mother who shaped every corner of his world, and whose death left him unable to navigate reality. His crimes were horrific, but the path that led to them was paved with trauma, isolation, and emotional damage that no one ever recognized or intervened in. And in the end, the question that haunts experts is not just what Ed did, but what created the mind that did it. When psychologists began studying Ed Gein, one of the first concepts they focused on was attachment, the emotional foundation every child forms with the person who raises them. In healthy homes, attachment gives a child safety, confidence, and a sense of self. But Ed's attachment to Augusta was built on fear, shame, and total dependency. He didn't receive comfort or acceptance from her. He received warnings, punishments, and a worldview where the outside world was dangerous. Instead of learning that relationships could be supportive, Ed learned that the only safe place was inside his mother's approval. That kind of attachment doesn't strengthen a child. It traps them. And for Ed, that emotional trap became the center of his entire identity. Enmeshment is another term experts use when describing his upbringing. In a normal parent-child relationship, there is emotional closeness and boundaries. The understanding that the child is a separate person with separate feelings, thoughts, and choices. In Ed's home, there was no such separation. What Augusta believed instantly became what Ed believed. What she feared became what he feared. Her opinions about the world, about women, about morality, and about danger replaced anything Ed could have discovered on his own. Psychologists later said that Ed didn't just follow Augusta's rules. He absorbed them until they felt like the only possible truth. He couldn't challenge her because he had never learned the emotional strength required to disagree. Enmeshment meant he didn't grow into his own person. He became an extension of hers. This leads to another key concept: arrested development. Although Ed grew into an adult body, experts say his emotional development stopped at a childlike level. He struggled with independent thinking, emotional regulation, and basic decision-making. He needed instruction, validation, and approval in a way no adult should depend on another person. Inside, he wasn't functioning at 30, 40, or 50 years old. He was functioning more like a scared, confused teenager who never learned who he was apart from his mother. When Augusta died, he didn't have the tools most adults rely on during grief. He didn't know how to cope, adapt, or build new relationships. The skills simply weren't there because they had never been allowed to grow. But it's important to pause on a crucial point, one that matters ethically, psychologically, and morally. Many people experience abusive homes. Many grow up with controlling parents, isolation, shame, and emotional trauma, but they do not become violent. Ed Gein's case cannot be explained by one factor alone. His life was a rare intersection of extreme isolation, dominance, untreated mental illness, lack of outside relationships, and complete opportunity. Almost no one knew what was happening inside that farmhouse. No teachers intervened. No relatives visited. No neighbor questioned why Augusta kept her son separated from the world. It wasn't one cause. It was a storm of many causes happening at the same time. This complexity creates an ethical tension that true crime viewers often struggle with. On paper, Ed is responsible for what he did. He caused real harm, real loss, and real trauma to families who never recovered. But when psychologists looked at his history, they also saw a man shaped by a home where abuse, control, and fear were never interrupted. He was not a mastermind. He was not a calculating monster. He was someone whose emotional development had been stunted so deeply that he never grew into a full adult mind at all. Both truths exist together: responsibility and tragedy, accountability and damaged psychology. And that dual reality forces us to think beyond headlines or horror stories. So what does Ed's story mean for the rest of us? Especially for parents, teachers, and anyone who works with children? There are warning signs that appear long before a case ever turns into a headline. Extreme isolation, especially when imposed by a parent, can be a major red flag. Children who are taught to fear everyone except one parent often grow up without the social tools needed to function safely in the world. Another warning sign is when a parent makes their child their entire emotional world, cutting off extended family, friendships, community, or school activities. Homes where shame and fear are the primary tools of control also create long-term emotional damage that can follow a child into adulthood. These signs do not mean a child will become violent, but they do signal a home where healthy development is being blocked. Ed Gein's case is disturbing not because of what was found in his house, but because it shows what happens when a child never gets to form an identity outside a controlling parent. His life reveals how emotional captivity can shape a mind for decades. It shows how untreated mental illness can worsen when mixed with loneliness and grief. And it shows how a community's failure to intervene can allow a dangerous situation to grow unnoticed. The lesson here is not to sensationalize Ed. It's to understand the psychological roots that allowed this tragedy to form in the first place. Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden deserve to be remembered as real women with families, memories, and lives that mattered. Their names are often overshadowed by the horror of the case, but they were daughters, friends, and members of a small community that never fully recovered from losing them. Their stories remind us that true crime is never entertainment. It's a record of people whose lives were taken far too soon. As we close this story, it's important to honor them with respect, not reduce them to characters in someone else's tragedy. If there's one lesson this case leaves behind, it's this. This story isn't just about a killer on a farm. It's about what happens when a child becomes an emotional prisoner, and no one steps in early enough to break the cycle. Homes that isolate, homes built on fear, homes where one person controls every thought. Those are the environments where emotional damage grows quietly and dangerously. When we understand the psychological roots, we can recognize the early signs in the real world, and maybe prevent the next tragedy before it ever begins. Before you go, if this psychological breakdown gave you a new perspective on the Ed Gein story, hit the like button and share this video with someone who cares about understanding the why behind these cases, not just the headlines. Drop a comment with the next case you want broken down from the childhood and trauma angle, and tell me your city and the time you're watching so I can schedule future uploads when you're online. Monsters are almost never born. They're built over time. And the more we understand how they're built, the better chance we have to stop the next one.